Welcome to the Run Strong podcast, episode 034. Rob Jones, still in the UK.
Good morning.
Good afternoon. How are you getting on over there, mate?
It's good. The rain started the other. I actually went running. It's June, but there were hailstones. What is that about?
Oh.
Horizontal hailstones hitting the side of my face. I had to hide under a tree.
Global warming.
Global warming, that's it. I was meant to be lovely weather. What's going on? No.
And yeah, I wondered why you had a coat on, and then watched the story and was like, okay, I see why.
Yeah, that patch of blue was the only patch of blue. It was a lovely run, but horizontal hailstones reminded me of why living in the UAE is lovely. You don't get that.
No, you don't. Although now we are seriously cooking over here.
Yes, I love the heat.
Seriously cooking. Yeah, you might look forward to coming back maybe for like the first 10 minutes of your run. I had what did I have this morning? An hour 15 easy, and I got my routes a bit wrong, so I ended up doing an hour 45. The first hour was easy, and then it hit. I started at 6:15 because of the lockdown here. You can't leave your house till 6 a.m.
Yeah, that's right.
On the canal. So yeah, at about an hour 5, hour 10 in, suddenly I was like, okay, here it is. The heat is here. It's like just going past that 7 a.m. barrier. You know exactly what it's like. And then it just ramped up and up and up, and you're just like, yeah, this is only going to get hotter. That's all you can think about, isn't it?
I'll tell you something, that's the one, well, there's quite a few good things, but that's one thing you don't have to worry about here is you can get up, you can run anytime. So I don't have to plan to run first thing in the morning. I can run at lunchtime. I can run in the evening. It frees up a lot of your day. Yeah,
that is nice to have. I have now moved my bike indoors.
I've seen that against the window.
Yeah.
How long did you last till? June? Start of June? That's not bad.
Yeah, and it's only because on Saturday, just gone, we had a virtual ride for a sportive that I'm an ambassador for in the UK called Tour of Pembrokeshire. And I just was like, we were starting at 9 because we wanted guys in the UK to be involved. So there was 6 for them, 9 for us. And in the week before, my iPhone that I use for Zwift had started freezing because of the heat. So I was like, okay, I either buy another fan. So I've already gone through one turbo. So I've bought a fan for the turbo. I've got a fan on me, and I was like, I'm going to need to buy another fan for the iPhone. And I was like, Tom, stop being an idiot and just move your bike indoors.
And then a fan for your extension lead.
Yeah, exactly. So I am indoors now. There was some shuffling around, but now I am set up, and probably luckily it ended up being well, I did 200k in the end on the trainer. Do
you reckon you finished? Is that you finished riding outside then for the season? Will you do any outdoor rides?
I love riding outside, and I don't mind the heat. The issue I have at the moment is the amount of non-official mask police that are out there. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm more than happy on the trainer if it means I get to avoid people shouting from a socially distanced way away of put your mask on when there's no one else around me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't care at the moment. I'm happy indoors. When I think this week we've seen a huge relax in the mask policing going on, and I think next week we'll see a little bit more, which is only a good thing as far as I'm concerned. If you're obviously in a crowded place or you're indoors somewhere, then no problem, get a mask on. You need to be safe. 100% agree with that. I just think in these temperatures outside, wearing a mask, even when you're cycling on your own, you're just asking for respiratory trouble. And I think there's a fair few number of people out there who are just taking it far, far too seriously and bringing so much animosity to people who are trying to just exercise.
Yeah.
If you're really that bothered about it, then you keep your mask on and keep 2 meters away and don't worry about other people. But it seems to be the stories I'm hearing, mate, are just, I just think the people who are carrying out the mask shaming, if you like, should be ashamed of themselves. It's ridiculous.
Mask shamers should be ashamed.
Yeah, it really is. Really is. So no, I'm happy indoors at the moment. And yeah, it was quite nice to see a number like 200Ks back in my training books. It's been a few months since I was going anywhere near that. Yeah. So you might remember, but December, January, February, my long rides were always around 200 Ks. Here in Al-Qudra, it's so flat. You can sort of do that in your 5-6 hour timeline. So to be back there again felt quite good. But yeah, on a trainer, it was interesting.
So that was what I was going to ask. Do you, for the long rides on the trainer, do you differ anything up? Do you listen to podcasts, or are you just zoomed in?
I actually, for this ride, I normally listen to something or watch something, but for this ride, because it was in sort of, not out of respect, because it was in aid of something, and normally when you ride the Tour of Pembrokeshire, you're doing it either with a group of mates or you're on your own, or for me, I'm like trying to time trial the course as fast as I can. I'm not listening to anything. I was like, okay, I'm not going to listen to anything. Mm-hmm. So we had a little Zoom chat on, although there wasn't much talking in there after the first few hours. And yeah, I just rode with the wind of the fan in my hair and nothing in my ears. It was good. It's important. It's nice thinking time. And similar this morning, I had a long, sort of back to doing my long runs now, and I never run with anything in my head when I'm outside. And I went, instead of running around where my local neighborhood is, which is always tends to be under an hour, so I had a long run out on the canal. Mm-hmm. And it's the best time for thinking. Really, really is. You sort of have that internal head clear out, internal head meeting, and get your things in order. And I've really missed that. So Saturday and today showed me, like, I am ready to be back outside doing my longer sessions, but equally I don't mind being inside at the moment either. I'm not going crazy, put it that way.
Good mix.
Yeah. And for you, mate, I guess you're spoilt for choice for routes and things. Have you got any sort of decision-making fatigue?
It's what I'm finding, the hills, whenever I first came out here, the hills that I find struggle to run up, I don't even notice anymore. So the undulating terrain, it's interesting how quickly you adapt. And every week I'm going, someone's banging on the door. What the hell's going on here? I'll keep talking whilst I go and answer it.
Live on the podcast.
Get the post in. No, so what I'm finding is, he's buggered off. Oh, well.
Video version's good enough.
What I'm finding is that I'm becoming much more efficient on the hills, and my running economy is really, really improving. So it'll be interesting to see how that translates to the flat and the heat again when I come back. But like the other day, I thought, do you know what? There's a route that I always do, and every summer when we come back, I always try and smash myself up this hill. It's just over 1 kilometer. It's got an average of, I think, 8% over this kilometer, but the middle section is 12.5%, 13% for about 600 meters. And then it flattens off at the start and at the end. So I thought, I'd done a long run, and at the end, I feel quite good. I'm just going to have a crack. And got my fastest time up it by about 20 seconds. So I was like, oh, hell. What had I been doing before? So it's interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, that's great, mate. That shows a really good sign to do that at the end of a long run. Really good.
So, and I hadn't thought about it, because usually I go, right, I'm going to have a crack at this at the end of the run. I hadn't thought about it at all. I just thought, I've got a nice easy run, but at the end, let's go. Let's have a go.
Let's go. Awesome.
Took the shirts off.
Start to Run is within its second week.
Start to Run is in its second week. Yeah, the guys are crushing it. Absolutely crushing it. What's interesting now is we've got some guys that are on week 2, and we've got some new guys that are starting week 1 again. So we're starting to get that cycle of people. They're all coming into the same WhatsApp group. So the community spirit is huge. They're all sending pictures of their meals, of their runs, of their data. They're all asking questions. They're all helping each other out. And actually this morning, they put in their run times. So some of them are going to meet up in small groups, socially distanced, and do their sessions together, which is really what we wanted from the start, wasn't it? Amazing. Getting people beginning to run, but in small groups.
Yeah, exactly that.
Really exciting. If anyone's interested in the Start to Run program, you should send me an email.
A lot of people are interested, mate.
A lot of people are interested, yes. It's perfect for beginner runners. We have to stress this, beginner runners. People that want to start running, not can run a marathon already, and want to start again, it's for new runners.
Yeah. And a big part of the program, here's my segue, mate, for the morning, is around people getting back into running without the worries of injuries and going out doing too much too soon. And on today's show, we have a guest who is called Kate Richardson, and she's from the UK. And she is a physio, and I was really lucky enough to work sort of under her when I was in Southampton, Solent University at the High Performance Academy there. She was the lead physio, and she was very good at talking to us sort of as peer-to-peer, although we were very much at a different level to her. She was way smarter than we were. She would teach us why she was doing things and what to look for in athletes. And she talks a little bit about her screening process, which she has to do at the start of every university term. And, you know, she has up to 50, 60 athletes. So she would help us as coaches understand what's going on with the body, how to look at things, and feedback to her different movement patterns that we're seeing with the athletes and things. And so I learned so much at the time, and she's so good enough to come back to the podcast, or come back on and talk to me on the podcast about how she looks at injuries, how she deals with them, what athletes can do, maybe if they're screening themselves from home and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of knowledge dropped on this podcast, but it's a really, really good interview. So we will go into that and then chat a little bit about it afterwards.
Definitely.
Here is Kate Richardson. Welcome to the show, Kate Richardson.
Hello, thank you for having me.
All the way from the UK. Rob should be here with us. He's in the UK, but he couldn't make the same time. So you've just got me today talking through injury reduction. But first, Kate, just introduce yourself and give us a little background about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name's Kate. I'm a physiotherapist. At the moment, I work full-time at Solent University, and that's actually where I met Tom originally. We've got a high performance academy there, which I sort of lead the physio side of things for. And within that high performance program, we've got about 30 different athletes across loads of different sports. And essentially all of those guys are dual career athletes, so they're kind of mixing their study with their sport. And the level of those guys, it varies in terms of their abilities and things. So, you know, we've got guys that just play for our Bucks team, and then we've got, you know, athletes up to sort of international level, Olympic level as well. So I just kind of offer support to those guys in terms of injury reduction, which we'll obviously talk about today, and then obviously I, you know, treat them when they have their injuries and things like that. Alongside that, at the moment, I'm also doing a bit of contractor work for the EIS. So I've been working a little bit with the British sailing team. And also England Lacrosse as well. I do some part-time work with those guys, covering their camps and like pitch side stuff for them.
Sound very busy at the moment.
Well, yes and no. Obviously, with everything going on, it's been a big change. But yeah, doing what I can, as everybody is, sort of from a virtual perspective. So yeah.
Yeah, and when I was at Solent, you had the delight of working in pretty much like a smallest corridor in the world.
Yeah, we have the cupboard. We have the cupboard physio room, and then we had the Dungy basement gym as well. So yeah, we've now upgraded to a multi-million-pound sports complex, which I have a really nice airy physio room that opens out onto our gym with a track, a 30-meter track down the middle. So we've gone up in the world. But
that sounds like it, and it's currently really empty, I'd imagine.
Well, yeah, that's the sad thing. You'll have to come back and check it out.
Yeah. And I got one question I want to get off straight away before we go into some things that you've got prepared. But I would be interested to know, what have you seen with people obviously being back home? Has there been a common theme of injury happening in the last, say, 2 months from people now being at home, or maybe sitting down more, or doing home exercises?
Yeah, I think for the population that I work with, it's probably a little bit different, because the guys that I see are obviously either team sports or, you know, runners, gymnasts, all of those types of things. So I guess those guys are probably quite used to doing a lot already. So I guess in this period, some of them have actually taken a little bit of time off to recover and have a bit of downtime, or those that should be on pre-season and things like that. I think maybe for the more sort of general population, I guess some people now are doing more running because that's kind of the only option that you have. So yeah, I think in general, you are kind of likely to see more overuse type injuries and getting people spiking from doing nothing and then going into stuff that they're not used to. And that's generally when you start to see kind of injuries occurring. I think, yeah, those are probably the main ones, just when you're not accustomed to doing something. But like I said, the guys that I've been working with, touch wood, haven't really had too many injuries over this period of time because they've actually not been doing their sport. So, you know, like the footballers, the basketballers have a huge change of direction component. So, you know, if they've not been doing those things and just been doing some straight line running, you know, you could argue that they're not as much, you know, at as much risk of kind of those types of injuries now. But again, those types of, you know, sports people, if their stuff is not their norm, that can still kind of potentially put them at risk for injuries and things like that. So yeah,
that's always something I'm just thinking, because I'm trying to piece together different like patterns that I'm seeing with runners and a lot of the triathletes that I'm training, and I've not quite got there yet, but I have got an idea of what is occurring more than other things. And a lot of it is around more sitting, so like getting tight in their hip flexors and so I wonder if that's the same with you know, a lot of the athletes who they were sat down a lot anyway during the day, I guess, with uni, and if they're student athletes.
Yeah, for our students, like depending on their course, they'll be in quite a lot. Obviously, like your home setup, it's going to be different for everybody, and for some it might be fine, but others, yeah, they might be kind of slouched in one position. Like, I think the main thing is it's a lot of people get quite fixated upon being in a specific posture is bad, but it's more of the case of, I would say, just moving more. So there's not really one bad posture. It's just don't stay in the same position all the time, because then you get problems. And I don't think you need to kind of think too much into it. Just keep moving, take little breaks, those sorts of things for people who are now maybe sitting more than they used to, I think is the key.
Good advice. Right, you have very professionally got some slides together for my viewing right now, but I will make this available on YouTube as well. But we are recording on the podcast, and we'll do our best to describe what we see. But yeah, Kate, it was really, thank you so much for coming on, and I'll let you go through what you've prepared and jump in with questions, which I'm sure I'll have at various times.
Yeah, and again, I said I put a few things together just more as an outline, because when you sort of talk about injury reduction, it's such a vast topic, and I could probably talk about it all week. So kind of just get the few kind of key things across as to kind of what it is and all the things that are involved, and then kind of where I guess my role as a physio kind of comes in. So. Ooh, that work? There we go. Yeah, so I think when you're kind of tackling the topic of injury reduction, is kind of how I like to call it, I think the key thing that I like to think of is that, and where people get confused as well, is that injury can't really be predicted or prevented, because there's so many sort of interactions of like loads of different factors, and it's kind of impossible to control everything. But we can kind of, with a systematic approach, try and reduce those risk factors and sort of identify what some of the risk factors are. But actually kind of preventing injuries completely and predicting when they're going to happen, at the moment, we can't do that. We haven't kind of got there yet. But the way I sort of approach injury reduction, I tend to kind of follow this framework, which is by, I think it's Mark Rowe, And it's a 6-stage framework looking at kind of individualizing injury risk management in sport. And in reality, it's probably not quite as simple as these kind of 6 stages. But I just thought it was kind of useful to just kind of give you a flavor of how I sort of start to approach this. And ultimately, it looks at, the first stage is looking at like injury trends. The second stage is looking at risk factors. And I'll go into these in a bit more in a sec. The third stage is looking at what the actual demands of that sport are, and then what the athlete's profile is as well. So kind of getting that overall picture. And then putting together a management plan and then monitoring that plan. So you're kind of having that constant reflection as to, you know, whether your intervention works or not, essentially. So if you kind of look, I know you guys can't see, but an example here of kind of this framework in a little bit more detail. And this is based on Gaelic footballers, you know, someone who's sustained a hamstring injury, but I'll try and relate it a little bit more to running. So when you look at your injury trends, this is kind of like your injury probability, essentially. So when I have an athlete come to me, say it's a runner, and I kind of want to look at all of these things, I want to know, you know, what is the probability of injuries in this specific sport? I think in, you know, runners, there are, you know, running related injuries are quite high. The research, like the stuff that I've managed to find, there were quite big variations in like numbers of injury incidences. I think it ranged from like 30 to 80% of injuries in running. And that again, I think was about, one of the studies I found was between 7 and 59% of people get injuries per 100 running hours. And I think the big differences in that were mainly due to whether they were novice runners, recreational, elite runners, things like that. But ultimately, you want to sort of build this picture of the person in front of you and all their needs. So your injury trends, you know, like I said, the incidences, what the common injuries in that sport are. And, you know, in runners, obviously it's going to be predominantly your overuse type injuries in your lower limb. So things like tendinopathies, muscle injuries, stress fractures, things like that. So it's kind of good to get a picture of all those sorts of trends and what is available and what is kind of commonly seen. Then your sort of second stage is looking at the risk factors for those things. And really, you'll find loads of different things in like the research about this is a risk factor for hamstring injuries or, you know, whatever. But I think really we can only kind of confidently say that previous injury is kind of a known risk factor for sustaining another injury, along with increasing age. Unfortunately, the older you get, more likely you are to get injuries. And also, I think the other big thing is poorly managed load as well. And you'll find, like I said, loads of different things that may or may not influence injury risk, but I think the quality of, well, not necessarily the quality of the studies, but I guess the population that you're looking at, it's quite hard to relate studies to who you've got in front of you, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So those are kind of like the first sort of two things that I kind of have in the back of my mind when somebody comes in. The third thing is looking at like the sport demands. So, you know, obviously a footballer, the requirements for a footballer is going to be very different to a triathlete. So therefore, when I kind of look at assessing somebody, you know, that gives me an idea as to whether I need to look at, you know, pure strength, or is it more their endurance? And, you know, do I need to kind of look at this person maybe under fatigue, or, you know, different things like that. And I guess you can kind of use this in terms of rehab as well as like the prevention or injury reduction side of things. Ultimately, you kind of need to know where the person needs to get to, or what their requirements are, and so you can then kind of build up what their capacity is, if that makes sense. So, you know, understanding like the total amount of mileage that you do in a training week versus a competition week, for example, so that you can then get a bit of a picture as to what that person needs to be able to do for their sport. And then you kind of come on to the next stage, which is the athlete profiling. And that's kind of where I guess my role fits in a bit more, but also very much scientists. If you're lucky enough to work in a multidisciplinary team, your sports scientists, your strength and conditioning coaches, lifestyle advisors, they all kind of chip into this part. And it's kind of looking at essentially the physiological characteristics of the athlete in front of you. And that might be, like fitness tests, a VO2 max. It might be looking at strengths in terms of a 1 rep max, or on an isodyno, all sorts of things. But also it might be more like your biomechanical assessments. And for me, this is kind of where my musculoskeletal screening fits in. And for those of you who don't know or haven't had a screening or been through it before, it's basically a process where I kind of someone comes in and I'll just kind of look through how they move. I'll have a look at sort of joint mobility, range of motion, sometimes some strength tests as well, just essentially to try and build up like a picture of how that athlete moves, what their kind of go-tos are. And then with that, you kind of try and piece it together with everything else and put together like a management plan for that athlete and prioritize kind of what that athlete needs based on kind of what you've seen, and also based on, the things that they need to be able to do for their particular sport. And then obviously, there's no point in doing all of that unless you're kind of going to monitor it in some way, or keep tabs on progress, and obviously all of that is kind of massive. And so for one person to do like a physio alone is almost impossible, so you do kind of have to work really closely with the coaches and strength and conditioning coaches, and if you've got a physiologist and a nutritionist, then brilliant. But I guess in reality, it's not necessarily as straightforward as that. So I think there's a nice study by, I think her name's Natalia Bittencourt. I put the link at the bottom. But I think rather than just focusing on what all these like risk factors are, I don't think it's necessarily completely or as linear as that. And I think what we need to do is kind of try and figure out how all these variables interact, and rather than just looking at them in isolation, we sort of need to try to determine like a risk pattern, if that makes sense. Because that way you're kind of considering all these sort of interconnected interactions between all these different factors, which embraces the complex nature of sports injuries a lot better. Because one thing on its own, might hold some weight, but if you kind of link it to everything else, and I think we don't really know yet all the factors that like interplay and how much weight one thing has over another, and we can sort of try and guess. But I just thought, it's quite a nice model for those who are interested to go and have a look at.
So this would be more like if someone, instead of saying, okay, you're injured, this is how you got there, this is how you'll get better, and once you're better, off you go again. This is more like, okay, you've got injured, we've got you better, now we need to make sure that we identify how that happened to stop you getting back into another loop of just re-injuring yourself again. And
this doesn't necessarily have to be following an injury, but it's just looking at all the sort of factors or variables that could influence something happening. So an emerging pattern, i.e. an injury. This might be a nice example. So for example, if you think about a hamstring injury being something that you want to kind of reduce the risk of. There are so many factors that might influence that. So for example, as we kind of spoke about before, previous injury is a massive one. So if that specific individual has had a previous ACL injury or even a previous hamstring injury or calf injury, they're more likely to kind of sustain another injury. The other things that might influence that could be, their calf function or their hamstring strength endurance. It might actually be their sprint mechanics. And I guess it's a case of sort of from what you assess, I guess, as a physio and their previous history and the things that they've told you, it's kind of weighting them. So there are some circles on there and it's like a big web basically, but the kind of the thicker lines and the thicker circles, you can sort of highlight the more heavily weighted variables. And they might be the things that you spend a bit more of your time on addressing. And that will be different for every person, if that makes sense. So it's really individual. And it's just working out sort of how they link together, and ultimately how that kind of creates more of a pattern for injury. So you still, like from the previous things you were saying, I would still sort of go through that process of trying to identify everything. But my kind of point really is that there's no sort of magic recipe. A lot of it will be trial and error. And I think really it's sort of finding the balance between everything, like, your load management and your training load and your previous injuries and your physiological capacity. And I think really starting with like the end goal, like identifying what the end goal is and working back from there is probably like a good way to start, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it would. Do you know of, or could you recommend any like home screening for people who maybe don't have access to a physio or a physio with the skills to screen them? Is there any good, let's say for runners, are there any key things that you would be looking for?
And I was gonna come on to that in a minute, but there's some nice infographics around, I think, for runners. Tom Goom, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's a physiotherapist, I think he calls himself the running physio, and he puts out a lot of nice sort of graphics, kind of giving just a lot of advice really on, if you've got an injury, how would you maybe modify your load, how you should, if you're experiencing pain, kind of what's okay and when you should keep running and when you should maybe take a few days off. And I think he has a rule of, if you're getting back into running from an injury, if you complete a run and then your symptoms return back to normal within 24 hours and things sort of settle down again, then you can kind of attack another run. So he kind of puts stuff out there like that. He also has got some good examples with some pictures and demos, I think, as well, of some of like the qualities that are beneficial in runners. Things like calf capacity, and mobility around the hips, around the ankle and things like that. So I think it's obviously quite hard to kind of demonstrate and go through those things. So I think, I would direct you to those to have a little look at that. But we can certainly kind of chat about, how I would kind of go about a movement assessment. And I certainly think there are a few things that you can kind of do yourself to get a bit of a gauge. But then obviously there are going to be other things that it will take someone else to kind of pick up in terms of movement quality and things like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's funny. It's like my mum is a physio as well, and she's retired now. But for years, I got into coaching running and understanding more around the body, we would sit and almost people watch and just start diagnosing people with different gait patterns and sorts of postures and stuff. And you do it around other people and they go, how the hell did you see that? And it's just something that you have to kind of do and be trained at to be able to see it, right? And I'm sure your level of knowledge would be way better than mine. So you'd see things that I couldn't see. So a lot of the time when people are asking me, you know, what can I do to identify it, I'm thinking like some of the time you actually just, you need the training for it and you can't see it. But stuff like knee to wall, you know, like if your toes are against the wall and your knee's not touching the wall, then you can kind of self-diagnose that you've got incredibly tight calf, lower leg.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think, if I go to the, I think, you know, the way I approach a screening is essentially looking at loads of different things that make up efficient movement. And there's a really nice sort of wheel by Joanne Elphinson, and it's basically, she's kind of identified some of the key components, I suppose, of effective movement, and that ranges from, you know, posture, balance, strength, flexibility, your confidence in your beliefs, dissociation, which is the ability for you to kind of move body parts separately to other body parts, and being able to do that in a timely, coordinated way. There's so many things really that kind of add up to moving well. It's, and people often think about the main things that people look at probably in a gym setting is like strength and mobility. But it takes more than that for it to kind of become an efficient movement, if that makes sense. So I guess, yeah, I would obviously look at, when somebody comes in, I would look at their posture. But I think the thing to note is that obviously there are so many different postures for people, and posture, a certain posture does not equal an injury or pain. Just because somebody, you may class them as having asymmetries, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person is A, in pain, or B, is going to get injured. But what it can kind of help you with is kind of getting an overall picture of maybe the strategies that they tend to adopt and things like that. But going back to kind of, I guess, what you said about what the guys, you know, people can do themselves to sort of screen yourself, I suppose. I guess there's, you know, when I start to look at a screening and I've looked at their posture, I'd also want to kind of look at their strength. And I said, obviously, at the start, it kind of comes back to that sort of capacity thing, like where do you need to get to? And, you know, having a good baseline strength, you can't really go too far wrong. But, you know, whether that is specific to, you know, the demands of your sport, you know, that can be different. So obviously a sprinter and a triathlete will need different kind of different types of strength, and the metabolism of the muscle will be different. So, you know, I would look at, for a runner, 100% I'd want to look at their calf raises. And if they're an endurance athlete, I'd want to look at that calf raise capacity. So not just how much can they lift or push through their toes, but how many times can you do that? Because if you're running, you know, miles and miles, and you haven't got that capacity and that endurance in your calf muscles, something's going to break down. And I think, you know, it varies from, you know, depending on how old you are and, you know, male or female, the amount that you kind of should be able to do changes. But with, you know, with young sort of 20-year-old male, you know, elite level, or, you know, people are taking it pretty seriously, you want to be able to do about 38 to 40 single leg calf raises. And that's kind of a standard that I would sort of try and set for my athletes coming in. As you get a little bit older, that will decrease a bit as well. There are slight differences in the research between male and female, but I think it's still quite individualized, again, really.
That's not easy for listeners to try and do that many.
No, it's not. It's not. I've done it.
38 to 40.
But yeah, and so I think that's something really quite easy that I think anyone can do at home, is just stand on one leg and literally up and down and until you can't do anymore. If, you know, depending on your sport, if you're doing particularly long distance runs, you kind of want to be getting up to a good amount there. And, you know, the other thing that I would also want to look at with runners and things would be, you know, quad strength, glute strength, because at the end of the day, you might actually have a really well-conditioned calf muscle. But if your glutes and your quads aren't strong enough, then your calf muscle might have to work even harder to propel you. So if you're getting calf pain or calf strain and you think that your calf's weak and then you do more calf raises, well, actually your poor little calf might just be knackered because your glutes and your quads aren't kind of doing their kind of share of the work. So I guess it's not always a case of looking at a muscle in isolation. It's kind of looking at how everything fits into that bigger picture. And that kind of, on this wheel, that's where the sort of kinetic chain, like the timing and the coordination of your movements is so important. And, you know, what I would look at is, you know, is there a breakdown somewhere? So if I would give somebody a task, and that might be a squat, a lunge, a step up, you know, maybe body weight, and I would just want to look at how they perform that movement. And I think there's quite a bit of controversy around whether physios and strength and conditioning coaches should be correcting people's techniques and telling, you know, things like that. You know, should we be doing that? Because, you know, there is such a variety in the way people move. But for me, I think it's not so much a case of which strategy is right or moving, you know, how they're moving, but which is the most relevant for the task that they need to do. And ultimately in most, you know, in life in general, not just sport, we need more than one strategy to sort of control our joints. And sometimes we need, you know, more stiffness around a joint to help us, you know, manage heavy loads and things like that. Other times we might just need more coordinated, quick responses. So I think it's really, for me as like a physio, it's, can we give our athletes more options? It's like, what options have they got? And can we kind of give them more options, if that makes sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So, you know, I guess one of the things that I hear a lot is people come to you and say, my pelvic stability isn't very good. And I'm like, okay. And my question, like, I'll bounce straight back, will be, okay, so what does that mean? Like, who told you that? And what are you doing with that piece of information? Because when you think about pelvic stability, kind of inverted commas, pelvic control, that kind of isn't just one thing. It's really vague, in my opinion. And, you know, whenever I'm looking at somebody move, I will always kind of want to make sure that I'm asking specific questions that I want to get answered. So pelvic control relies on having good balance. It relies on having adequate strength. It requires you to be able to, you know, potentially decrease the angle of your joints if you're thinking of a squat, or and do that in a way that, you know, you're able to lower your center of gravity. You have to be able to coordinate lots of different joint movements. So if someone says that they've got poor pelvic stability, it's like, well, which part of that?
Yeah.
Because often I think, you know, people tend to give the treatment as strengthening. Like, you need to strengthen your glutes is quite a common one. And it's not, you know, that might be the case. But I think it's also just being aware that there are so many other things that kind of can influence that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, like you say, a lot of the tests around that for most common people would be, okay, let's do like a glute bridge and see how you go. And then they do it fine. And you think, oh, well, it's not that they're, you know, they haven't got poor pelvic stability actually, because they can do that. But then they stand up and you see that they're like completely tilted, like huge curve in their lumbar spine. And you're like, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that, and again, I think people could probably give it a go at home, but one of the things that I look at, if I get them to do, take like a lunge, for example, I think one of the things that, particularly where all the science gets a bit confused, is people will look at a movement, but there'll be a lot of confounding variables. So, for example, if you look at like a single leg squat as potentially as a measure for pelvic stability or pelvic control or whatever it might be, if somebody performs that movement really badly, you can't really say from just looking at that movement whether it's a balance problem, a timing problem, a strength problem. You see what I mean? So what I try and do is kind of pick a relatively simple movement that doesn't require a lot of balance. So it might be like a bilateral task to begin with, like a squat, or just like a split stance, like on the spot lunge. And then I would kind of look at how they move through that movement without any sort of step into the movement. I just literally get them split stance. Can they go from up high to down low? And what happens in that movement? Because actually what you can see is in the first third of the movement, from pretty much being upright, as you start to drop, that portion of the movement doesn't actually involve strength. So what that part of the movement is essentially is your brain talking to your foot. So it's that neuromuscular control. So with the first little bit of the movement, you don't really need a lot of strength. So if you start that movement and you're already kind of, your pelvis is shifting left, right, and center, it would be quite easy for people to think, oh, weak glutes, or, you know, but actually it might just be that it's like a timing problem and that your brain isn't talking to your foot. If it's a case of that part of the movement's fine, but then as they get lower down towards the bottom of the movement, then we start to see some funky movements going on, or some excess arching of the spine or whatever. Then we might start to think, okay, the load is a little bit more prevalent at that range, and therefore that might be kind of more of the area that we need to look towards. And you can also get a little bit more specific in terms of thinking about which muscles are working at that portion of the lunge. So actually, again, you may get given some banded clams, some lying on your side with a band. But actually, when you think about that portion of the movement, you're going eccentrically in outer range with your glutes. So actually, maybe we need to work our glute muscles eccentrically rather than our abductors concentrically, if that makes sense. So you can get a lot more sort of specific with the questions that you're asking, and then that can make what you put in place more relevant. And like you were saying with runners, particularly if it's that like first phase of the movement, like I said, where strength might not be an issue, I think if runners have been having issues with whatever it might be, calf, knees, ankles, and they've been doing loads of strength exercises and it hasn't got better, that's when I maybe sort of start to think, okay, well, maybe it is something else. Maybe it's the timing of my movements. If they can do a lunge, sort of a static lunge perfectly, but then you ask them to step into that lunge, like on alternating legs, and then it goes to pot, then you might start to think, okay, maybe it's a bit of a timing problem. And obviously runners, what do they have to do for miles and miles? It's just jumping from one leg to the other. So if they haven't got the ability to kind of time that, and they're doing that for hours on end, then you're probably going to get some problems at some point.
Yeah, that's where a lot of run drills and things become very handy. There's one, I've seen you talk about this before, and it's on your slide that you've currently got up, but it's around effective movement, and one of them is confidence, beliefs, attitudes, intention, and motivation. And what I've seen you say before is post injury or coming back from injury, some of it can actually be psychological. What do you think about that. I think I saw you talk about it maybe a few months ago. It could have been the end of last year. Has any new thoughts going on that?
Yeah, I think when anybody gets an injury, it affects people in different ways. So I think a big part of, you know, my role as a physio, really, if somebody comes in with an injury, is restoring their confidence in their self and their ability to be able to move. Because, you know, a lot of the time, if someone's injured, you know, especially if they've never had an injury before, it could be quite a scary thing, and your body can kind of want to shut down in a way to protect it. And although those sort of strategies, you know, initially are a protective mechanism, and that is a good thing because we do need to allow the body to heal if it's injured, it's important that those kind of strategies don't stay around for a long time. And I think that's, you know, a key part of rehab is being able to restore the confidence in the person you're working with and sort of show them what they can do, give them, you know, achievable goals, rather than saying to someone, yeah, we've done this, it's injured, you're not going to be able to do this, you can't do this, and don't do that, and definitely don't do that. And just sort of trying to kind of show them all the things that they can do to kind of help restore that confidence. And in terms of like attitudes and beliefs, I think you know, for somebody to buy into what you're saying, you kind of have to give them the information about what their problem is and kind of how you're aiming to help them, so that they can kind of make an informed decision themselves as well. And, you know, you don't need to kind of give them tons and tons of scientific jargon, but essentially it's kind of, you know, you need to explain to somebody what their issue is and how you can kind of get back from that. And I think it's really important to just always understand what their goals are as well, because you might think that, well, obviously this person wants to get back to doing X, Y, Z, but actually, you know, they might not be under too much pressure because they haven't got any competitions coming up. So actually they're happy to just not push it too much right now. Or it might be a case of, we've got, you know, the biggest event of your life in 5 days time. So it's kind of, you know, understanding, you know, what their goals are and how you're going to work towards that. And at the end of the day, I think I think there has been some research on it. If people think they're going to get better, they will. And if they won't. And I think that means that there's quite a big emphasis there on how you as physios and coaches communicate things to your athletes or your patients. And that can be, I think it can have a huge impact on how well people recover as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Talking about recovery, well, not so much recovery, but upon immediate injury or someone feels a twinge or something go, what is your current thoughts on icing injuries immediately?
Well, to be honest, the research has changed on it. So it's gone from rice to police to peace and love. So I think the main things, the reasons why there was a bit of sort of bad press, I suppose, about ice, was that it was seen to sort of potentially inhibit the natural healing process. So when a tissue gets injured and you kind of get that bleeding in that acute phase, you get like loads of blood flow to the area, which have kind of loads of cells and chemicals in to essentially get rid of all the debris and all of the kind of nasties in there, and try and start to clot that bleed and kind of start to build that tissue back up again. And I think by icing, you kind of get that vasoconstriction, so you get less blood flow to the area through the narrowing. And I think the kind of key stuff around that was that you're therefore not actually getting some of the good stuff to the area and not your inflammatory response. Excuse me. having said that, I still think there are positives of using ice. And I think those effects, as far as I'm aware, are often when you use ice for like really, really prolonged periods of time. So like, you know, for several times throughout the day, and you're doing it every day in the first week, and it's quite an intense amount. But on the flip side of that, you know, I think there have been studies that show that it does have a good pain relieving effect. And
yeah, people want to feel like they're doing something, don't they?
yeah, and to be honest, I'm not sure if there is a complete consensus, but I think I do still use it in acute injuries, but I think you just have to be careful with you know, how often you use it.
Would that be the same with anti-inflammatories as well?
Yeah, and again, that's kind of delving into, you know, your biochemistry and your that side of stuff. But yes, some injuries you might not want to use anti-inflammatories, again, because it might slow down that healing process. It depends on the injury and the tissue type as well. I think there's a difference really between sort of tendons and, you know, muscle or fractures, and I think depending on the type of injury it is, or the tissue that's involved, there may or may not be sort of inflammatory markers or chemicals in the area. So I think, yeah, I think it varies, and it's something that I tend to sort of avoid really giving advice on that, because it's more, you know, I can't prescribe, I'm not a doctor. I think it's probably safest to say speak to your GP about that. But yeah, there are different, there are times where you would, and you potentially wouldn't use anti-inflammatories depending on the structure involved. If that makes sense.
Nice, middle of the road answer there for us.
Political answer there.
Trying to get something out of you, but it's not going to happen. Good. And I've got another question around that I think happens a lot with the sort of population that I'm working with, or general population. Probably not so much with yours, but maybe you might see this around exam time with student athletes. But how much life stress can cause a risk to be elevated for injury?
Yeah, definitely, a lot. And I think I was going to mention earlier, actually, when we were talking about sort of identifying where your kind of current capacity is to where you need to get to. And when you start to sort of think about loading and the term and the definition of load, essentially load is like a sport and non-sport burden of in terms of a stimulus that you put on the human body, and that can be a psychological, physiological, or like a mechanical stressor. So when you think about load, it isn't just a physical, and actually, you know, if you are stressed, you know, if you have got, you know, if there are major life events going on, you know, it has actually been shown that that can actually influence your body physiologically. So it's definitely really, really important thing to consider, not only in terms of reducing your risk of injury and looking at that side of things, but also when you're recovering from an injury and going through that rehab process. And I think it's always worth, especially if you're working with, you know, athletes or a particular population, to, you know, get some feedback in terms of what their wellness is. So, you know, are you sleeping well? How stressed do you feel? And all of those sorts of things, because actually it can really influence, you know, not only your readiness to go out there and train and do things, but, you know, it can affect your, you know, your body as a whole. Definitely.
And one certainly affects the other, right? So if you're stressed within life and you might not be sleeping too well, that can affect your dietary choices, which can have a big impact on your, like you said, your readiness to train or your motivation to train, which then if you pick up an injury off the back of it, just gets you back into that cycle of rubbish, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it all kind of links together. And I guess like one of the first slides that I showed, it is this kind of like, it's just this web of, and it's, I guess, our role as, you know, support staff to athletes to try and figure out where they fit in together and just kind of try and work out a balance. And I think it differs for every single individual. And I think, you know, as long as you're, you know, approaching those topics and you're not, you know, forgetting about them, and you're making people aware, probably as much as anything, that these things can influence, you know, your ability to recover. You know, if you haven't had enough sleep, you know, you're going to feel groggy and you're probably going to crave bad food and, you know, all of those sorts of things. And I guess it's just ultimately identifying what's most relevant to you or your athlete that you're working with, or if you can kind of figure that out yourself, like if you sort of start to see some of these patterns in yourself, then you can, you know, start to look at strategies and, you know, solutions to those kind of issues. And hopefully, you know, essentially you think of athletes, we always think of, you know, people we're working with as athletes, but they are human beings at the end of the day. So everything else needs to be working nicely before you can be an athlete. So yeah.
Good. Yeah, I agree. It's always nice to have an athlete come and say, okay, yesterday I slept really crap and today I need to take the rest day, and they've become really aware of how they feel. But from my experience, those people have normally gone through an injury phase because of too much stress to get to that point of understanding how that means. I think if people haven't, they're probably thinking, nah, I would always just train. But it's only when you get that degree and it stops you from doing what you love to do you understand the impact that stress can have.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Good. Well, Kate, it's we've nearly been chatting an hour. It's been brilliant. Have you got any other points that you wanted to get across?
I don't think so. No, just you know, hopefully it just kind of gives you an idea of the complexity of trying to reduce risk of injury, and that there are so many factors that, you know, into play. But I think ultimately, if you know, have the basics in, you know, strength, mobility, and, you know, you have a good handle on your load and your training volume, and you work with your coaches on that, and, you know, you're aware, you have an awareness of, you know, how you're functioning and what your normal is, and if you're like becoming to deviate from that, you know, with sleep, whatever that might be, then it's just kind of trying to prioritize those things, and, you know, the more you can do that and work with other people in their areas of expertise, and the better.
Yeah, and it's interesting to get it from a physio's point of view, because I think so many people think, oh, I've picked up an injury or something that hurts me a bit, and I'll go to the physio and they'll give me an exercise and then it'll get fixed. And it's like, it's just, as we're, you know, the slide we're looking at now, you can go on to the video and have a look if you're not, but it's around effective movement, which is obviously not movement when you're injured, and it's just so many things that go into it, so much more. And I think to put the not blame, but to put everything into your physio to be able to fix you is just, it's one very small part of the puzzle to get right.
Yeah, definitely.
I think I hear it so much is people saying, I'm doing all my physio exercises and it's still causing me trouble, or I'm still not better. And I'm thinking, yeah, it could be a few months before you start to feel better again. You know, you can't just have it all at one, just because your physio is giving you an exercise to do and you've been doing it over and over again. There's so many other areas to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, Kate, thank you so much.
No problem at all.
Just reiterate to our listeners, if you want to go on and have a look at some of the slides that we've been talking about, you can head over to our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link in the description to this. Kate, you're on Instagram. Do you want to
Yeah.
share?
PhysioFit 101 on Instagram.
That's an easy one.
On Twitter
Easy
as
one
well.
to remember. PhysioFit 101. I'll put that in the show notes as well. And if people, can go over, check your page. You do put some good infographic or posts up there as well. And I do use them actually to repost a few times. So people should go over there and should follow you. Gain some of your wonderful knowledge. Brilliant. All right. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Tom. Take care.
So, mate, that was obviously pre-recorded. You couldn't make it. I think you had a hair appointment, was it?
I was looking after my child. Thank you.
Oh, same. So, yeah, that was Kate Richardson, which was
I actually
a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us what?
So I've listened to, well, I didn't listen. I watched the video because she had some amazing slides that went with this, and they just completely added to this. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want even more and to take more away from what you've just heard, you need to watch the YouTube version and get the slides as well. Mate, huge thing for me there was she banged on about baseline strength, and having that baseline strength is key to prevent injuries. And we get that all the time. People, it's the first thing people skip, isn't it? They just want to go and they do their runs, but they don't want to do any of the accompanying strength work and then wonder why they get injured.
No, exactly.
Yeah. And it's made me, as soon as we finish this, I'm going to go and see how many calf raises I can do as well.
You need calves like bowling balls, mate. That's the plan.
A 20-year-old elite male, 38 to 40 single leg calf raises. It is on.
And that's tough, mate. One of my first triathlon coaches said I'm not allowed to run fast until I can do 25 single leg calf raises.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time going, huh? What do you mean? And then they were like, yeah, that's the rule. And I was like, all right. So it took me a few weeks to build up to that. And then 25 was, I can knock out 25 quite easily now. Mm-hmm. 38, I don't think I've got 38 calf raises in me.
Single leg. I want to know what is the what's the movement standard for 38? Are we starting horizontal and extending, or are we dropping below horizontal?
Yeah, interesting one. I should have asked that. Normally we used to do them on a platform, so you'd have an eccentric phase and a concentric phase. Yeah. Don't know if she's making that for that standard as well, but even 38 calf raises off the floor is tough. But if you think about what you're doing within running or any other like high velocity sport, it's probably about right. It is needed, for the demands of it.
For the running endurance side of it, for sure.
Yeah. So a lot of information has come across there. I do recommend that you head over to the video version and watch, because she has got some interesting slides to be showing you. Mate, are you gonna change anything after listening to that for yourself?
Do you know, actually, the other thing that was really interesting for me was that she said that the load, your training load, isn't just physical. And, I know this already, but it's also the mental element, and the full supporting your lifestyle really affects how you recover and your risk of injury. And I know this, but I always just put it at the back of my mind and I forget about it. And it's always focusing on getting the training done, and maybe you don't put as much focus on like you say, the sleep or the nutrition or the work stress, and you don't adjust those things. So it's also, paying attention to that more is something that I need to take a bit more of an interest in. Not that I think I'm stressed or my sleep is bad. My sleep's actually much better recently, but I just keep that in mind.
You have a Whoop band, right?
I do, yes.
Marcus has gone on a little bit of a Whoop sort of destroy mission lately, which I like. I love it because he always challenges things, which is great, right? So I tend to defend Whoop a little bit because I think it's a very powerful tool, but I am going to get to 1 year of using it and then do a bit of a large sort of review for it. But the biggest thing, like Marcus says to me a lot, is, okay, your Whoop's telling you this, what have you changed? And I end up changing very little, but I like to track and I like to see what's happening. Now you've been reminded again about that load is not just physical. Does that make you look at your Whoop data a little bit more? And would you change off the back of it?
So the Whoop, I don't really look at so much. I got the Whoop to look at my sleep, and that was the main thing I wanted it for, because I was using HRV before that, and for HRV you put in when you go to sleep and when you wake up, but that's effectively the number that you get. Whereas what interested me about the Whoop was the fact that it will tell you deep sleep, how many times you woke up in the night, disturbances, etc. And then having Hannah, I thought that would give me more accurate representation of my sleep quality, rather than just me waking up and going, how do I feel? Because sometimes, you know, you can feel fantastic and your sleep's been awful, and vice versa. So I find that really interesting to look at, and how that affects my training and how I feel in the morning. Usually that's one of the first things I'll look at and I'll process, is how much sleep have I had? How many times did I wake up? Knowingly or unknowingly? And then I make judgments based on that. And it seems to be going quite well with my training recently anyway. And I'm feeling strong and fit and healthy, and I've, touch wood, not been injured in a very long time. So
yeah, excellent. Mate, I have another question for you. I've got a few questions for you today.
It's not a thing. We need to talk about Kate Richardson here, not me, but go.
Are you looking at what races are coming back on? And if so, are you looking at how they are going to be run?
I haven't, for me, not yet, no. I've set myself some challenges in mind, but then I've looked at 2021 races, not yet in 2020. But whenever races come out towards the end of the year, I'll adapt and dial in. I'll speak to my coach and we'll talk about how we need to change things up for those races. It'd be interesting to see though. I mean, lots of the events that I generally do are smaller events. So I didn't do the Dubai Marathon, which obviously high numbers. I did do the Rack Marathon, but even then, in terms of scale, that's a pretty small event in terms of people size. Yeah, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how these events are run, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm looking at now at what events sort of some organisers are putting out, what they're going to do. Ironman was the big one. It put out what it's going to focus on for its races, and it kind of put me off. I felt really deflated after.
What are they thinking?
They are essentially, it looks like they're getting rid of like feed stations on the bike. They're only going to do what they call the special needs bag. So you put what you need in a special needs bag, and then you stop and get it, basically, and pull out whatever your nutrition is. There's going to be no handing off of bottles. There's no food out on tables, that sort of thing. And then similar on the run, you will have a special needs bag, and it'll be, you stop and grab what you need from it and then carry on. And I just feel like it's taken all the racing away from it. Like, part of the reason you sign up for those sort of races, like big races like Ironman, is you're treated like a pro athlete almost, you know, like you're handed water bottles through feed stations. You can take a cup, take a sip, throw it, and know that it's going to be picked up. You know, whereas if you stop to drink out your bottle, like, what if you've got a 750 ml bottle, you're not going to drink all that 750 ml, but equally you're not going to drink like 100 ml and then throw the bottle. Do you know what I mean? So I'm like, how are they going to, I don't know how that's going to happen, but
I guess you'd have to, will they do more loops then on the run course and more looped bike course? Otherwise you'll have to have 6 or 7 bags, I guess.
A lot of people are saying it looks like it's going to be, they're going to really push to have people wearing camelbacks to be self-sufficient.
I mean, I'm not sure I like that.
I know. Same, mate. Same. I was like, oh no, this isn't good. This isn't why we race.
I guess though it would only be, is it a short-term solution they're looking for to try and get races back up and running, and then they'll revert back to what they're used to, maybe?
Could be. I hope so. There's nothing like that feeling in a marathon or when you're on your marathon run in an Ironman and you're flying through feed stations and you're just grabbing water and you're chucking it over yourself, and then you get the next one, and like, it's such a cool feeling to have. And
I always tend to find as well, actually, whenever I run through a feed station, I tend to speed up a bit. And you come at the feed station, you're feeling so elevated, you're flying, and then you obviously come back down to normal pace. But you always come out of a feed station like super pumped. But imagine having, to stop, find your bag. Oh shit, what number am I? Where is it? Somebody's moved it, open the bag, get something out, get the wrong thing, because you'll be stressing and you're I want to try and get in and out nice and quick. It probably cause more gathering of athletes into small spaces because everyone would be like fiddling around with their bags and things.
That's very true, actually, mate. Yeah, that is very true. You feel like you shouldn't, but you do. You stress when you have to stop for no reason, or even, I remember last year in South Africa, I was on the marathon and I really needed to pee. And I've trained myself to pee on the bike. I've trained myself to pee in the swim. I've not quite got there pissing while running yet. And I needed to pee. So I stopped at a toilet. So there was only two, and there was two athletes in the toilets. And I was like, and I'm stressing around, and I was like, stuff it. I'm going to stand here and just pee. And the bloke comes out of the toilet, he looks at me, he goes, it's free. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm all good. And carried on running. But I was like, I'm so annoyed. I had to stop to wait for someone. Like, whereas if there was no one in the toilet, I'd have just dived in, peed, and then carried on. I still had to stop. But I was like, why is my mind not okay with waiting 5 seconds? But then it would have been okay if the toilet was open too. So it's a whole new challenge, I think, mentally.
I've tried that before as well, but peeing on the bike, can you pee and pedal at the same time?
Yeah, I can now, yeah.
I've tried it once and I just couldn't. I had to stop pedaling. So, and then I slowed down and slowed down and slowed down. It was just like, hurry up, otherwise I'm going to fall off. I need to uncleat and get off. It's a race against time. Yeah. All over my shoes. It was terrible.
I think these new races I think races from now on are going to look different. I think they're going to add whole new challenges in mentally more than anything for people. And I think the athletes with good patience and sort of more process mind, because it's not just you that's going to have to wait for your bottle or, be whatever away from groups, whatever. Like, it's going to be the same for everyone, isn't it? So
that's it.
If you're going with that mentality, then yeah, it should be okay. But if you're going with the mentality of, this wasn't like it used to be, then I think there could be some real fallout from these new type of races that they're going to have to do. Like, they do have to do them, obviously, from a safety point of view.
The people that get stressed, the people that are the PB hunters, so the people that do the same course every year and look for a PB on that course, without taking into account conditions and whether the swim was shortened, etc., etc. They'll just all complain that I had to wear a camel pack, so I wasn't as aero.
That's true, mate. Yeah, that's true. Be interesting if it gets faster.
Yeah.
Imagine.
All the camel pack companies and I just going, yes, come on, let's go.
Yeah.
There'll be an Ironman camel pack in the race village.
Of course there will be, mate. There we are. Good. I hope everyone got something from that show and this show and that interview with Kate. There's a lot to take in. I really recommend that you might listen to it first, but then hop over and watch it as well. We'll put the link to the video in the show notes. And if you have any questions, head to Kate's Instagram channel at PhysioFit101. And if you have any questions for us, please email endurance@innerfight.com or rj@innerfight.com if you want to get on the Start to Run program, which is the latest program to kick off, and it really is kicking off. There's a whole great group on there, so jump on there. And then if you want to get in touch with me, you can at tw@innerfight.com. That's it for this week.
See you next week.
I am guest hunting still, and I have one lined up for next week, so look out. It's going to be a good one.
I need to start lining up some guests.
Yeah, you're letting the team down there.
Well, you keep producing them, so there's no need for me to do anything yet.
There we go. Good. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks for listening.
Take care. Stay safe.